You ever get that feeling? Like there's this thing you got to do, maybe a big project at work or finally cleaning out that closet. Heck, even just answering an email,
Yeah.
and all of a sudden you just want to do anything else.
Yeah, totally. It's like that thing you've been putting off just keeps getting bigger and scarier in your mind.
Right. And we all deal with it. Procrastination is like the ultimate universal experience.
It really is. Doesn't matter if it's something small or a big life goal, we've all been there. Putting things off.
And that's exactly what we're diving into today. You sent over this awesome article called The Science of Getting Started, How to Beat Procrastination. And
Yeah, it's a good one.
it is. It's packed with insights. So our mission today is to figure out what really makes us procrastinate, and more importantly, how to actually get stuff done.
It's not just about willpower. It's about really understanding the how and why we procrastinate. This article really digs into all that, the psychology behind it, and some practical stuff you can actually use.
Okay, so where do we even start with all this? The article mentions this procrastination cycle. What's that all about?
Basically, it's like this five-step loop. First, you make these assumptions like, this task is going to be so boring or it'll take forever, those kind of thoughts.
Oh yeah, I've definitely been there.
And those assumptions lead to discomfort, like anxiety or dread. Just the thought of the task makes you feel bad.
Ugh, yeah, I know that feeling.
So then what happens? You start making excuses to avoid starting. I don't have all the info, or it's not the right time, stuff like that.
Right, right.
And those excuses, they lead to avoidance activities. All of a sudden, cleaning the bathroom seems way more appealing.
Oh, for sure. I'm a pro at finding those avoidance activities.
And finally, you face the consequences of putting it off. Missed deadlines, more stress, and that task is still hanging over your head, starting the whole cycle over again.
It's like a vicious cycle, really.
Exactly. It keeps you stuck. I remember this one time my friend had to write this big report, and he spent the whole day, like, meticulously organizing his sock drawer. Anything but the report. Right.
That's hilarious, but I totally get it. The task just seems so huge and unpleasant that anything else feels productive.
It's a classic case of procrastination in action. And what's really interesting is this isn't just about bad habits, it's actually rooted in our brains.
Oh, tell me more about that.
So the article talks about this interplay between the pleasure principle and two parts of our brain, the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex.
Okay, so brain stuff. Let's break it down. The limbic system, that's the more like primal part, right?
Exactly. It's all about now. Instant gratification, seeking pleasure, avoiding pain, all that. It's driven by instincts and emotions, and it doesn't really think things through.
So that's a voice saying, hey, that report sounds boring. Why not watch another episode of your favorite show? Instant fun.
Exactly. It wants that quick dopamine hit.
And the prefrontal cortex, that's like the more evolved part, right?
Yeah, it's behind your forehead, and it's the part that plans, makes decisions, and thinks about long-term consequences. It's the part that knows you should be working on that report.
But it's slower, right? Like less insistent than the limbic system.
It is. It takes conscious effort, deliberate thought. It's not as fast and automatic as the limbic system. So when you're faced with something you don't want to do, the limbic system usually wins, pulling you towards those easy, instantly rewarding things.
Makes sense. So procrastination wins because our brains are kind of wired to choose that quick pleasure over long-term goals.
That's the gist of it. And then you add impulsivity into the mix.
Oh, right. Impulsivity. What role does that play?
Think of it like a turbo boost for that limbic system. Impulsivity is acting on an urge right away, whether it's a thought, a feeling, or just that sudden desire to do something.
Like that urge to just drop everything and check social media, even when you know you shouldn't.
Exactly. The limbic system is like, check your phone, see what's new. And if you're impulsive, it can overpower that slower, more rational part of your brain.
So you're saying if I'm working on something and suddenly want to check the news, even though I know I should be working, that's impulsivity winning.
Yeah, pretty much. The article actually lists 4 traits of impulsivity: urgency, lack of premeditation, lack of perseverance, and sensation seeking.
Okay, break those down for me.
Sure. So urgency is that feeling of, I have to do this right now, like no matter what. Then there's lack of premeditation, which basically means not thinking about the consequences before acting on an impulse.
So acting without thinking.
Yeah, kinda. Then there's lack of perseverance, meaning you get distracted easily and want to switch to something more exciting.
And lastly,
Sensation seeking. That's basically being drawn to things that give you that immediate excitement or pleasure.
so someone who has all these traits, they'd probably struggle a lot with procrastination, right? Like their do it now button is just super sensitive.
Exactly. And that's where the article brings up this really cool tool, the HLT method.
HLT.
Ah,
What's that? Like telling yourself to stop.
kind of. It stands for hunger, anger, loneliness, and tiredness. The idea is before you give in to that urge to procrastinate, check in with yourself. Are you hungry, angry, lonely, tired?
Interesting. So if I'm about to scroll through social media instead of working, I should ask myself if I'm actually just hungry.
Right. If any of those things are true, you're more likely to give in to those impulses from the limbic system. Addressing those basic needs can actually make those urges a lot weaker.
Wow, never thought about it like that. So it's like checking in with your body before making decisions.
Exactly. Now, the article also mentions a bunch of other traits that can make you more likely to procrastinate. Things like how good you are at stopping yourself from doing something, or planning, or even controlling your emotions.
That makes sense. So it's important to understand these general patterns, but the article also talks about knowing your own procrastination profile. Like, why is that important?
Because we don't all procrastinate for the same reasons. Figuring out your own triggers is a big step in finding ways to actually stop doing it. The article actually outlines 5 types of procrastinators.
5. Okay, I'm curious, what are they?
So first, there's the thrill seeker. This type actually loves that last-minute pressure. They might even put things off on purpose just to get that adrenaline rush.
Really? Wow. So they kind of use procrastination as part of their process.
Exactly. Then there's the avoider. They put things off out of fear, fear of failure, criticism, sometimes even fear of success.
Procrastination as a defense mechanism. That's interesting.
Then there's the indecisive type. They get stuck in the decision-making process, either because they have too many options or they're afraid of making the wrong choice.
I can see that. Too many choices can be paralyzing.
Next, we have the perfectionist. They procrastinate because they're afraid their work won't be perfect. It's better not to start at all than to risk not meeting their own crazy high standards.
That's tough. That all or nothing thinking can really hold you back.
And finally, there's the busy procrastinator. They're always doing something, but it's usually just a bunch of less important tasks to avoid the bigger, harder ones.
They're busy, but not really productive.
Exactly. They use busyness as a shield.
Wow, those are some pretty specific categories. It's like we all have our own, like, procrastination style. And the article also mentioned something about our triggers being either action-based or mental emotion-based. What's the difference?
So action-based triggers are like habits that lead to procrastination. For example, always checking email first thing in the morning can totally derail your plans to focus on something else.
Ah, so it's like a cue that sets you off on the wrong path.
Right. And mental emotion-based triggers are internal, like feeling overwhelmed by a task or not believing you can do it.
So it's like those feelings and thoughts that sabotage you from the inside.
Exactly. Now, you might find this surprising, but the article also points out that procrastination can sometimes have a few, unexpected benefits.
Wait, really? Procrastination can be good.
Well, in very specific situations, yeah. Sometimes delaying a task can actually save you effort, like if it turns out to be unnecessary later on. Or you might end up doing other, smaller tasks while you're avoiding the big one, so you're still getting something done.
So like doing all the laundry to avoid writing that difficult email.
Exactly. And sometimes waiting can give you more time to think things through, especially when there's a lot of uncertainty. But keep in mind, these are exceptions. Most of the time, procrastination just leads to bigger problems.
Okay, so we've talked about why we procrastinate. Now let's get to the strategies. How do we actually change things? The article talks about mindset shifts and practical tactics.
Yeah, and it starts with mindset. It actually connects procrastination to Newton's laws of motion, which I thought was pretty cool.
Newton's laws, like physics. That's interesting.
Right. So the first law, inertia, is about how objects at rest stay at rest. That really highlights how getting started is the hardest part. Overcoming that initial resistance is huge.
It's true. That first push always feels like the most effort.
Right. And then there's the second law, which is about force and acceleration. In terms of productivity, it means you have to focus your effort in a specific direction to actually make progress. Spreading yourself thin doesn't work.
Like multitasking usually ends up with you not getting much done at all.
Exactly. And the third law, that every action has an equal and opposite reaction, is about recognizing the things that help or hinder our productivity.
So instead of trying to power through distractions, We should focus on creating an environment that actually helps us focus.
Exactly. Now, speaking of getting started, the article talks about this 2-minute rule, which can be really helpful.
2-minute rule, what's that?
So when you're procrastinating on something, commit to working on it for just 2 minutes.
Just 2 minutes, that's it.
Yeah, just a tiny start. If you're writing a report, write the title in one sentence. If you're exercising, just put on your shoes. The point is to make that first step so small and easy that you can't say no.
I like that. Make the barrier to entry so low you can't help but step over it.
Exactly. And you know how sometimes you get overwhelmed by having too many choices?
Ugh, yeah, all the time.
Well, that's called the paradox of choice. It basically means that having too many options can lead to more anxiety, indecision, and you guessed it, procrastination. We get stuck trying to find the absolute best option and end up doing nothing.
It's like that story about the donkey who starves to death because he can't decide between two piles of hay.
Exactly, burden's ass. Classic example. So the article gives some tips on how to avoid that trap.
Like what?
Well, one is to focus on just one or two important things when making a decision. Ignore everything else. You can also set a time limit. Force yourself to choose within a certain time frame.
A decision deadline, I like that.
Another thing is to pick a default option beforehand. If you can't choose, you just go with that. And finally, aim to satisfice instead of maximize.
Satisfice, what does that mean?
It means going for something that's good enough instead of trying to find the absolute perfect option.
So good enough is better than perfect when it comes to getting things done.
A lot of the time, yeah. It's about making a choice and moving on. Maximizers, those people who always want the best, they often end up procrastinating more.
Makes sense. Now, the article also says something that I found really interesting. Forget motivation. Get started, and you'll become motivated.
Yeah, it's counterintuitive, right? We usually wait to feel motivated before we start something. But the article argues that it actually works the other way around. Taking action, even a small step, can create motivation.
Really? So you're saying instead of waiting to feel like doing something, I should just start doing it, even if it's just for 2 minutes, and then the motivation will come.
Exactly. Once you start making progress, you build momentum, and that keeps you going. You see that you can actually do it, and that motivates you to do more.
That's a pretty cool mindset shift. Okay, so let's talk about some of the psychological tools the article suggests for building that momentum. The first one is don't rely on your mood.
We often think we can only work when we're in the mood, but that's just another form of procrastination. The article says that you should just commit to starting, regardless of how you feel. Oftentimes, just getting started will actually improve your mood.
So action can actually change how you feel, not the other way around.
Exactly. Another tip is to break down big tasks into smaller, manageable pieces. Focusing on just one small part can make the whole thing feel less daunting.
Smaller bites, easier to swallow. Makes sense.
Right. Now, have you ever heard of omission bias?
Omission bias.
Yeah.
Not really. What's that?
It's basically our tendency to feel the effort of doing something more strongly than the consequences of not doing it.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Like you feel the effort of starting a workout, but you don't immediately feel the negative health effects of skipping it. That's omission bias.
Ah, I get it. So we focus on the immediate discomfort of doing something rather than the long-term consequences of not doing it.
Exactly. And to combat that, the article suggests actively visualizing the negative consequences of procrastination.
So instead of thinking this task is annoying, I should really picture myself missing the deadline and feeling stressed out.
Exactly. Make those negative outcomes feel real in your mind. That can be a powerful motivator. And it actually ties into the next technique, which is visualizing your future self.
Oh yeah, I've heard about that. How does that help with procrastination?
Well, by picturing your future self and how you'll benefit from completing a task or how you'll feel if you don't do it, you're basically connecting with that future self. It makes those future outcomes feel more real and personal, less like abstract ideas.
So it's like making your future self a real person you actually care about.
Exactly. And the article even mentions some studies where people who interacted with an age-progressed version of themselves in virtual reality were more likely to save for retirement.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. Just seeing that future version of yourself can make a real difference. Okay, what about the if-then technique?
Oh, that's a good one. It's also known as implementation intentions. It's basically about making a specific plan in advance.
So if this happens, then I'll do that.
Exactly. By deciding ahead of time what you'll do in a specific situation, you're taking the decision out of the moment when your willpower might be weak.
That's smart.
Hmm.
So instead of just thinking, I'll work on that tomorrow, I could say, If I finish my coffee, then I'll immediately open the presentation file and work on it for 20 minutes.
Exactly. It creates a clear link between a trigger and an action, making it more likely you'll actually do it.
Okay, these psychological tools seem super helpful for changing our mindset. Now, what about strategic planning? The article mentions this STING method. What's that all about?
STING stands for select one task, time yourself, ignore everything else, no breaks, give yourself a reward. It's a focused work approach.
Ignore everything else.
Yeah.
Definitely the hardest part for me.
It takes effort to eliminate distractions and focus on one thing at a time. The no breaks part helps with that, and then you reward yourself at the end, which makes you want to repeat the process.
So it's like training yourself to focus in short bursts. And the article also talks about the procrastination equation. Can you remind us what that is and how it can help?
Sure. The procrastination equation is motivation, expectancy x value, impulsiveness x delay. Expectancy is how much you believe you can succeed. Value is how important the task is to you. Impulsiveness is how likely you are to act on urges. And delay is how long it'll be until you get the reward.
Okay, so to be more motivated, we need to increase expectancy and value and decrease impulsiveness and delay.
Exactly. And the article gives tips on how to do that. For expectancy, break big tasks into smaller steps so you can build confidence. For value, focus on the benefits of completing the task. For impulsiveness, we already talked about the HLT method and other techniques. And for delay, you can reward yourself for reaching milestones along the way.
So it's like a formula for figuring out how to motivate yourself. What about temptation bundling? That sounds interesting.
It's basically pairing something you enjoy with a task you usually avoid. It makes the unpleasant task more bearable because you associate it with something pleasurable.
Like only letting myself listen to my favorite podcast while I'm doing the dishes.
Exactly. The article suggests making a list of your temptations and your dreaded tasks and finding ways to link them. It's like strategically bribing yourself to get things done.
That's a pretty clever trick. Okay, last one. The article talks about the Eisenhower Matrix. How does that help with procrastination?
The Eisenhower Matrix is a way of prioritizing tasks based on their urgency and importance. You categorize tasks into 4 quadrants: urgent important, not urgent important, urgent not important, and not urgent not important.
I remember that from school.
Right. So we often procrastinate on the important but not urgent tasks because we get caught up in the urgent but less important ones. The matrix helps you see which tasks really need your attention right now and which ones you can plan for later.
It's about making sure you're working on the things that actually matter, not just reacting to whatever's screaming the loudest. So we've talked about mindset, planning. Now let's talk about structuring our day to avoid procrastination.
Super important. A well-structured day can really minimize those impulsive urges to procrastinate. And one concept the article mentions is no 0 days.
No 0 days. What does that mean?
It means you commit to doing at least one thing, however small, towards your goal every single day.
Even if it's a super busy day.
Yeah, even then. It doesn't have to be a lot, just something that keeps the momentum going. It prevents you from feeling like you've completely stalled.
So if I'm writing a book, I should try to write at least one sentence every day.
Exactly. It's about building consistency, even if it's with tiny steps. And when you feel that urge to procrastinate coming on, the article suggests asking yourself specific questions.
Like what kind of questions?
Things like, what's one small thing I can do right now? Or what are my top 3 priorities today? Or even, how can I make this task a little easier to start?
It's like you're your own coach, pushing yourself in the right direction. What about just writing out a schedule? Does that help?
It might seem simple, but yeah, writing out a detailed schedule can make a big difference. It's not just a to-do list. It's actually blocking out time for specific tasks and figuring out when, where, and how you're going to do them.
So you're creating a roadmap for your day.
Exactly. And finally, the article talks about limiting information consumption. That's a big one these days.
I know, it's so easy to get sucked into that endless scroll.
Right. And we often confuse consuming information with being productive. We spend hours reading or scrolling and feel like we've done something, but it's often just a way to avoid real work.
So it's like pseudo-productivity.
Yeah, exactly. So the article recommends creating an information diet. Be more mindful of how you're consuming information, cut out the stuff that's not valuable, and be more intentional about what you let yourself see.
It's about being more selective with your attention, basically. Okay, so we've got strategies for mindset, planning, and structuring our day. What's the final push to actually get started?
The last part of the article is all about taking action. And one idea that stood out to me was Colin Powell's 40-70 rule.
I've never heard of that. What is it?
So, Powell's idea is that when you're faced with a decision or a task, you should aim to act when you have between 40% and 70% of the information or preparation you think you need. Waiting for 100% usually leads to overthinking and procrastination.
That makes sense. You don't have to wait until you have everything perfectly figured out to get started.
Exactly. And then there's the power of tiny steps. We've mentioned it before, but it's really important for overcoming that initial resistance.
Breaking things down into smaller chunks.
Yeah, big tasks can feel overwhelming, but if you break them down into tiny steps, it feels much more manageable.
So instead of focusing on losing 50 pounds, you focus on making one healthy choice at your next meal.
Exactly. Those small wins add up. And finally, the article talks about some common excuses we use to procrastinate and how to combat them.
Like what?
Like, it's not the right time, or I'm not good enough. But the truth is, there's rarely a perfect time, and waiting is usually just procrastination in disguise. And feeling like you're not good enough is often just a fear of failure.
How do you overcome that?
By adopting a growth mindset, understanding that you can improve your skills through practice and effort. And if you're telling yourself, I don't even know where to start, the answer is simple. Start with the smallest, easiest thing you can do.
Just take that first step, even if it's imperfect. Okay, last concept from the article. The energy pyramid.
Ah, yes. The energy pyramid basically says that our capacity for focused work and our ability to resist procrastination are tied to our overall energy levels.
Makes sense.
If we're tired, drained, stressed, or lacking motivation, it's harder to resist putting things off. The article talks about things like getting enough rest, challenging ourselves appropriately, and creating habits that support our energy levels.
So taking care of our physical, emotional, and mental well-being is crucial for beating procrastination.
Absolutely. It's not just about willpower or time management. It's about understanding all the different factors that contribute to procrastination and having strategies to address them.
This has been a really eye-opening deep dive. Overcoming procrastination really is a skill we can learn.
It is, and it's about figuring out what works best for you based on your own individual procrastination style.
So, to you, the listener, think about what resonated with you from this conversation. What's one zero day you might be creating in your life? And what's one tiny step you can take today to break that cycle? Think about it and let us know what you come up with.